Eddie is a journalist who wants to expose a millionaire scientist, but somehow ends up fighting against aliens who want to destroy the world. That's why today on the Summarizer, Venom. The movie starts with a satellite falling to Earth, and at the beginning we already have a problem, because in the crash a sample of some kind of rare organism or something like that was lost. But since one of the astronauts is still alive, first they concentrate on saving him. The thing is that he was not quite alive, but this thing had gotten inside him, and at that moment it attacks the doctors and ends up getting into the body of this unfortunate girl. The next day, we see the main character named Eddie waking up with his girlfriend Anne when they plan a date for that night. And there, we are told that apparently this guy is a reporter and is dedicated to unmasking the bad guys. A while later, he arrives at work, greets Richard at the reception, and goes directly to talk to his boss, who gets him an interview with Drake, a millionaire guy who wants to reaffirm that his rockets are safe and the crash was just an accident. Our character doesn't like this very much, but since he has no other choice, he has to do it. That night, he goes out to eat with Anne, where he tells her that he doesn't want to defend people who are not worthy. So she asks him to hold on so he doesn't get kicked out again. But well, later they return home to close the night in the best way.
I understood that reference.
Although in the early morning, Eddie gets up to get some water, and just in time an email arrives to Anne's computer, which is about a lawsuit against the millionaire for the murders of 3 people in a kind of genetic analysis. But well, the next morning we see Drake giving a guided tour for some kids, when he's interrupted by his partner Dora because he has to go change for the interview.
Kids, sorry to leave you. Allie, you're in charge.
And here, instead of asking about the rockets, Eddie accuses him of being a murderer and gets him kicked out of the place. And clearly his boss doesn't like him accusing people without a reliable source, so he ends up firing him. And as if that wasn't enough, his girlfriend also gets fired because of him, so she gives him back his engagement ring and then leaves him.
At least I'm not getting stabbed by some random guy on the street.
The thing is, the poor guy was right, because Drake does hide something pretty shady, and we see that the doctor from the beginning arrives at some kind of carnival where she kills a bunch of people and moves onto the body of a helpless lady. 6 months later, we have the millionaire trying to combine a rather strange organism with a bunny, where they discover that both have to be compatible for the symbiosis to work, which is something like a fusion between 2 organisms. So far so good, but at that moment Drake goes crazy and wants to start testing on humans, and although Dora doesn't want to do it, he threatens her and she has no choice but to accept.
You're a monster!
On the other hand, Eddie goes to a bar to drown his sorrows, but since Drake appears on TV, he prefers to go home. On the way, he crosses paths with a girl who lives on the street called Maria, and takes the opportunity to buy something in a store next door. He gets into an argument with the owner of the store because she recommended him to meditate, and the guy didn't like it very much. But in the middle of the fight, a thief enters and takes all the money from the cash register, although this is not very important. The important thing is that as soon as he gets home, he grabs a couple of beers and starts looking for a job. But since it doesn't work out very well, he decides to give meditation another chance. And that doesn't work out either, because his neighbor just happens to play the guitar. And a while later, it's time for Drake's first test on humans, and since the guy is a bit nervous, he calms him down and convinces him that he's a hero. But it's no use, because as soon as he sees the thing, he goes into crisis, and the poor guy ends up dying in the most painful way possible. That same night, Eddie returns to the store from earlier, but his friend is no longer there. But he doesn't pay much attention to that, because Dora is waiting for him, who explains that her boss is killing people on the street to do his tests. But our character is already very resigned, so he tells her that he can't help her, and for some reason, he thinks of stopping by his ex's house. And it's not such a good idea, because she just arrives with her new partner named Dan, who leaves them alone to talk. There we see that Anne is still angry, even though he misses her and wants to get back together with her. So after the rejection, he thinks things over a bit better and calls Dora, who helps him infiltrate the facility and explains that those weird organisms are aliens and are called symbiotes, or something like that.
What the hell is that?
After this, Eddie enters the lab, where he finds Maria kidnapped in a kind of prison, and in an attempt to help her, he breaks one of the glass panes, but the only thing he gets is that she attacks him and passes that freaky thing to him. Still conscious, he tries to escape, where he discovers that he now has some special abilities. Later, he arrives home a bit shaken and calls Dora to see if she's okay. But then, some pretty weird things start happening to him. The problem is that this thing is no longer in a controlled environment, and on top of that, in the street, it can do whatever it wants. And although right at that moment they manage to get a guy to adapt to the fusion, Drake is still quite worried about his symbiote. Later, Eddie comes to his senses and starts going through the photos among all the mess he made a moment ago, and then he goes to interrupt his ex's dinner because she's the only one he trusts. What happens is that in the middle of all that, he has an attack and ends up scaring everyone.
You are one sick dude.
Then, as Dan is a doctor, he takes him to get an MRI, but in the process, the guy gets some kind of seizures, so he sends him home to rest and tells him to call him when he has more information. And we see that things at the lab aren't going so well either, because the man who managed to adapt to the fusion begins to agonize, and they realize that sounds like the MRI hurt him.
Such poor design. Human beings.
And just at that moment, they discover Dora, but we'll leave that for later. Meanwhile, Eddie is trying to control whatever's inside him when Anne calls to warn him that he has some kind of parasite, which would explain the vomiting and the voice in his head. The thing is, his neighbor is playing music again, and since it's kind of bad for these creatures, Eddie's going to ask him in the best possible way to turn it down a little.
Whatever. Sure, man. Yeah, I'll just turn right down. Sorry.
Back to Dora, she apologizes to Drake and he kind of understands, but he needs her to tell him who broke into the lab. The thing is, once he finds out who it was, he gets so angry that he ends up leaving her with one of the organisms to take care of her. And at that same time, he sends a group to Eddie's house to capture him. Although it's not going to be so easy because the symbiote takes control, eliminates all the guards that get in his way, and ends up escaping. There, he looks at his reflection and what he sees is not very normal, so he starts to process what is happening to him while talking to the symbiote. But at that moment, Drake finds out that he managed to complete the symbiosis and goes a little crazy, so he needs to capture him as fast as possible. And as they start chasing him with everything they have, Eddie gets on his motorcycle and starts to run. Nothing happens though, because now he has a new friend to protect him from the drones. And in this chase, we see all the new skills of our character, which saves his life more than once, and even ends up exceeding Drake's expectations. They still end up running him over, but just when they are about to capture him, this thing completely takes over his body and manages to escape. Apparently, this organism has the power to regenerate itself, and for the first time, it comes out of Eddie's body and introduces itself as Venom. There he explains that he's going to use it as a vehicle and tells him that he needs his help.
Cooperate, and you might just survive.
On the other hand, we see that the lady from the fair arrives at the airport, and her symbiote shifts into the body of a babe who crosses by. After that, Dan realizes that what happens to Eddie is much worse than he thought, so he asks Anne to take him to the hospital as fast as possible. Later, we have Drake, who doesn't seem too concerned about his partner's death, because what he really cares about is that they let his symbiote die once he killed her. Meanwhile, Eddie tries to go to his old job to give the evidence he gathered to his boss. The thing is that his friend Richard won't let him pass, and as Venom wants to eat him, he prefers to leave. Anyway, nothing happens because now that this thing knows he wants to go up to the building, it helps him without any problems, and they enjoy the view for a while.
Your world is not so ugly. I'm almost sorry to see it end.
After a couple of complications, his friend helps him get into the place, where they have a conversation while Eddie leaves the evidence to the boss, and we see that in the end, these two don't get along as bad as it seems. And once he drops off the information, they get the hell out of there.
Jump.
The elevator thing isn't such a good idea though, because as soon as they get off, they have a few guards waiting for them, so Venom takes the opportunity to have some fun. And while he's getting rid of the threats, Anne shows up and takes him to the hospital. As you can imagine, he's afraid to ride in the same car as her, but since Venom likes her, he's not going to do anything to her. And for some reason, at that moment, this thing becomes a kind of psychologist and helps him with his love issues.
Oh, that's nice.
At the same time, the airport girl arrives at Drake's lab, and there, this other organism takes his chance to get revenge on him. Once they get into the hospital, Dan wants to hospitalize him because according to his studies, he is dying, but Venom gets angry and tries to kill him. Luckily, Anne turns on the MRI machine and leaves it on for so long that it ends up making the thing come out of his body, so they leave it locked in that room.
It's called fucking strategy, alright?
There, Eddie runs off and Dan asks for explanations, but while they're talking, Venom takes the opportunity to escape through the vent vent and ends up getting inside this little dog. And on top of that, the guards show up at the hospital and kidnap our character. After this, Drake starts interrogating him and tries to make him feel guilty. And since he now also has a symbiote inside him, he orders to kill Eddie while he works on bringing more of those aliens to the planet. But just before they get rid of him, Venom appears in Anne's body and saves his life. She also ends up returning the parasite to his body, and there he explains that Drake's symbiote is called Riot, which is the strongest of them all and is some kind of leader or something. So they have to go stop him, and even though Anne wants to go, Venom won't let her because it's too dangerous.
Not today.
Oh, that's bullshit!
Then we learn that Venom wants to stop the leader because if they all take over the Earth, he's gonna go back to being a nobody, and he happens to like the life he has on this planet. And we also see Drake preparing for the trip with his new friend, but at that point, he starts killing all the scientists for some reason, and that's when our guys arrive to try to stop him, although it's gonna be a bit complicated.
I mean, what are our chances?
Pretty much zero.
They still have to make the attempt, so a pretty epic fight happens that ends with Riot literally absorbing Venom, but luckily Anne arrives to help them and manages to get the two symbiotes separated from their hosts. So now the fight is between the humans. The thing is, Drake gets his friend back, and this doesn't end in the best way for our character. But just at that moment, his friend arrives to revive him, and when the spaceship is taking off, he manages to damage it, and then on takeoff, he ends up blowing everything to hell. The thing is, even though they get rid of the bad guys, Venom loses his life to protect his host. Finally, Eddie and Anne solve their problems, and both are offered their jobs back, but he's not interested in going back, because now he has a much better interview to do. But the important thing is that somehow Venom is still inside him, so they have to set some rules to prevent him from eating anyone. But as the creature is still hungry, they go to the store to buy him something. And luckily for them, at that moment the thief from before arrives, so they give him what he deserves, and at the same time, they take the opportunity to fill his stomach. Oh, and before finishing, we see Eddie going to the famous interview with a serial killer who threatens to kill everyone, but apparently this is left for the next movie. That was Venom. Comment which series or movie you'd like me to summarize for future videos. See you later.
Gotta work.
Okay. Bye.